Good evening. It's Friday, February 20th, and the U.S. Supreme Court today ruled against most of Donald Trump's tariffs. In response, President Trump said in a press conference immediately after the ruling that he is effective immediately adding an additional 10% to existing global tariffs, and he's seeking alternative measures to keep these tariffs in place.
Today I will sign an order to impose a 10% global tariff under Section 122 over and above our normal tariffs already being charged. And we're also initiating several Section 301 and other investigations to protect our country from unfair trading practices of other countries and companies.
What is the future of global trade? Are we going to get a renewed tariff war, or is this the end of tariffs altogether? We're going to find out. Additionally, it's reported that a third of the U.S. Navy is now positioned and or stationed around Iran or moving towards Iran as we speak. President Trump said that the world can expect to find out within 10 days or so whether or not a nuclear deal is to be reached with Iran. And if it doesn't get reached, we could be looking at a strike against Iran. So will there be a war with Iran soon? Will there be a regime change? And will the Iranian Supreme Leader Khamenei be replaced anytime soon? Will he be captured like the Venezuelan President Maduro earlier in the year? We're going to find out the answers to all of these questions and much more, including whether or not aliens actually exist in the U.S., with our next guest, Matt Gertken, Chief Geopolitical Strategist at BCA Research. This video is sponsored by Kalshi. It's a fully regulated platform that lets you trade on real-world events, from political outcomes to economic data. Sign up and use my code LIN, L-I-N. Link in the description down below, or scan the QR code here. And new traders will get $10 deposited to your account when you trade $10. Traders can put money down on their favorite teams, events, elections, and more in all 50 states, including California and Texas, and over 140 countries. More on that later. Matt, welcome back to the show. Good to see you again.
Thanks a lot. You too, dude.
Let me just start by showing to you a clip of Trump's speech, of him responding to what happened with the Supreme Court ruling and how he's characterizing the Supreme Court justices. Take a listen.
Well, thank you very much for being here. The Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs is deeply disappointing, and I'm ashamed of certain members of the court, absolutely ashamed, for not having the courage to do what's right for our country. I'd like to thank and congratulate Justices Thomas, Alito, and Kavanaugh for the strength and love of our country, which is right now very proud of those justices. When you read the dissenting opinions, there's no way that anyone can argue against them. There's no way. Foreign countries that have been ripping us off for years are ecstatic. They're so happy. And they're dancing in the streets, but they won't be dancing for long.
He later called them disgraces to our nation and insinuated that they're agents of foreign influence. And also he used the words lapdogs for the Democrats. So your initial response to the press conference that Trump held earlier?
Well, it was a momentous decision. I mean, the president has been for 10 years running elections, and he's won 2 elections on the explicit policy of raising tariffs. So he does have a personal mandate from the population, the voting population, to do that. And his method of doing it was illegal, apparently, because that's what the Supreme Court ruled. And specifically what they're highlighting is very true, very obvious. They focused on the revenue aspect. The power of the purse belongs to Congress, and specifically the House of Representatives. And so they said the president cannot levy tariffs in this way because he's raising the revenue, and that means he's usurping the power and violating the separation of powers. So that's a credible decision, of course. I mean, who am I to, judge? But what I would say is this: the president now has to do 2 things. One is save face, because he's just been slapped and rebuked in a stinging way. But then he's got to watch out for the midterm election, because it is in fact true that the tariffs are not wildly popular. In fact, I was just looking at a really robust opinion poll by Pew Research, that showed that only about 37% of Republicans believe that tariffs will help them and their family do better. And that's a terrible number if you are a Republican president, right? So in other words, he's going to come out with responses, in particular, Section 122 of the 1974 Trade Act. He's raising the tariff by 10% globally. That's his initial response. He's going to save face. But later, he's in fact going to allow tariffs to decline because he has to look out for the economy in the midterm election.
He's going to allow them to decline in what way? He's just going to cancel them without making a public notice?
Yeah, well, Section 122 supposedly only works for 150 days, and then you need congressional approval. So what he said today is, so the tariff effective rate was about 17%. It's now going to plummet to 9% because the court invalidated the tariffs, the IEEPA tariffs, and then he's going to push it back up to 19% with this Section 122. But then when that expires, I don't think Congress is going to vote, maybe, but I don't think Congress is going to vote to reinstall that tariff. So that means we'll start to be moving back down toward 9% over the next few months.
I want to show you this remarkable clip. Take a listen.
This must have been done to protect those other countries, certainly not the United States of America, which they should be interested in protecting. That's what they're supposed to be protecting. But I am allowed to cut off any and all trade or business with that same country. In other words, I can destroy the trade. I can destroy the country. I'm even allowed to impose a foreign country destroying embargo. I can embargo. I can do anything I want, but I can't charge $1.
That's kind of a key point. The Supreme Court didn't rule that he can't, wage economic war against other countries, just that the tariffs were an overreach of executive power. So are we going to expect, Matt, to see the president use alternative measures besides tariffs to clamp down on global trade?
Well, that's the beauty of the ruling. So first of all, he is correct there. And Brett Kavanaugh made this argument when the court held the arguments, which is that the IEEPA, remember, the IEEPA is a 1977 law that Congress passed, and it says if there's an international emergency, the president has these economic powers, these special economic powers that he doesn't normally have. Now, presidents always decide when there's an emergency, so that's all understood. Now, those powers that he has are extensive. He can regulate trade. He can compel. He can nullify. He can void. He can basically control and prohibit importation or exportation. So this is extraordinary, and that's what he's saying. He's saying that I could completely prohibit all importation from all of the world, but I can't raise a 1% tariff. And that's true under the ruling. It's amazing. But think about the beauty of the ruling. The beauty of the ruling is saying, yes, Mr. President, you do have these emergency powers, and you can use them. But if you're going to use them, you have to suffer the economic consequences of these really draconian powers. What he was trying to do was sort of a marginal change to trade so that he would get the benefit of the revenue. It wouldn't hurt the economy that much. And what they're saying is, well, no, you need Congress's permission to do that. If there's truly an emergency, like let's say we have a trade war with China, that could happen, is happening. You can use extraordinary powers. You just have to be willing to suffer the economic cost. And that means you could void all imports from China, but you'd have to suffer the economic cost of doing that. So now you can see the check and balance operates because the president is in check. He can use extraordinary powers in an emergency to save the country, but he has to be willing to accept the economic cost. He's not going to be getting any revenue on the side.
I see. And by the way, is the trade gap actually being closed by additional tariffs? Let's just establish that fact.
Well, so new trade numbers came out, and it was a very large deficit. It was about the same as last year in dollar terms. But of course, it's a little misleading because some people have not been showing it as a share of GDP, and you actually should show it as a share of GDP. So, but the point is, no, it's not dramatically curtailing the trade deficit. The tariffs have, well, think about it. The U.S. economy has been pretty resilient, and the U.S. economy internally has a saving and investment imbalance. We don't save enough. So we're always importing, we're running these trade deficits, and he imposed tariffs. But the fact is that since the economy remained robust, we were still importing a lot of stuff. And so we still had a large trade deficit.
Okay, so so embargoes aside, the president it appears he still wants to go down the tariff route for now. I mean, maybe you're right. In 150 days they'll disappear. But the White House is exploring how to keep Trump's tariffs if the Supreme Court strikes them down, says an NBC article dated a couple of days before this. His aides have been exploring alternatives for quite a number of months now. What are some of these backup plans? Can you comment on this?
Yeah. So as we saw today, the first one is Section 122 of 1974. That's supposed to last for 150 days, and then he goes to Congress. Now, it's conceivable that Congress could vote carry out some tariffs because Republicans are in trouble now. They've just been rebuked by the Supreme Court. They might need to answer the court and save their own credibility and bacon in the midterm. But the problem is that there's such thin margins, thin majorities in Congress that I don't think he's going to be able to get that vote. So then what he does is he goes over to Section 301 of the 1974 Act, and his trade representative, Jamison Greer, is going to look at intellectual property theft and technology transfer and use that as a reasoning for imposing tariffs. Now, those can be pretty large tariffs. The problem is that that's mostly going to boil down to China. That's the country that's most conspicuous in terms of those issues. So those unfair trade practices. So in a way, you can see the court system and the administrative state are steering the Trump administration in the direction of, rather than attacking random countries or allies, let's focus on unfair trade practices with China. Now, I think that is what's going to happen here. But because of the midterm election, the president is probably going to do a lot of diplomacy with China this year, and he'll probably wait till 2027 for these investigations to culminate in new tariffs.
Well, let's just review the International Emergency Economic Powers Act that the Supreme Court ruled supposedly was misused. Now, do you think he'll use this again if Iran were to be struck? And we'll talk about Iran in just a minute. Do you think the Supreme Court ruling today is going to, I guess, push the needle towards an Iran strike? In other words, he will engineer a national emergency and then he will actually have just cause for using this act.
Well, yeah. I mean, so the way that would work, though, to be specific, so the risk with Iran is that the U.S. hits them hard. They feel their regime is going to fail, existential risk. They strike regional oil infrastructure. Oil prices continue to rise. We're heading into a midterm election year. Midterm election. So that's a problem. Now, in that context, rather than raising tariffs, like he threatened to raise tariffs on countries that do business with Iran. But the problem is then you're raising the tariff and the oil price, which is really bad for an election context. Now inflation's really going up. So instead, I think what he would do is maybe he would ban exportation, because as we've just seen, the court showed that he can prohibit exportation under an international emergency. And so he could stop the export of oil, and America would have basically to keep its oil at home during an oil shock period. I mean, that's an example. Of course, he could also tap the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which would provide about 20 days of the difference if the Strait of Hormuz were closed. And there's, of course, other U.S. inventories. But that's an example of how he might use this IEEPA Act. It's interesting. The act was designed in the 70s to limit the president, but in fact, if an emergency is happening, and Iran would be one legitimately, then he has enormous powers.
So the announcement was made about an hour ago, so about 1:30 p.m. Eastern time, and the stock market hasn't really fallen in that news. In fact, we're still up slightly on the day of the S&P 500. Why do you think the markets aren't reacting negatively to an additional 10% tariff being imposed effective immediately?
Yeah, first, because it's temporary, like we talked about. Second, because the big risk for the market was that for now to eternity, all American presidents could unilaterally impose revenue-raising measures that had no end date. That has been removed. That power does not exist. So the stock market should be happy, because what it means is that all future presidents, if they want to raise taxes, they have to go through Congress, and that's a lot harder. You got to get everybody to vote to raise taxes, and taxes aren't always very popular. So this is a reassurance. The other thing is that revenue, since it was illegitimately raised, will now have to go back to the companies that paid it, which means that companies are going to have a bit of a cash infusion, because on the one hand, they get to raise prices on consumers. On the other hand, they're actually going to get a rebate for the unfair tariff that they paid.
Yeah. So what can we, going back to the midterms, what can we expect the administration to do to make Americans happy before the election of the midterm election later this year? Earlier last year, Trump said that he is thinking about a $2,000 tariff dividend. Later, he said he never said that. So now what?
Yeah. Well, one reason he said he didn't say that is because his legal team started to tell him that you can't really talk about the revenue, because they knew that if this was all about the revenue, that the court was going to shoot him down. And that's, of course, what happened. Now, today, of course, he talked a lot about revenue because he doesn't care now, because he's already been rebuked on that point. But But of course, if now these legal authorities that he's going to use going forward, he has much better legal standing to use them. It's just that they're much more limited than the IEPA ones that he was trying to get away with. So,
Sure.
look, I think your question is a good one, and I'm not, as always, I'm trying to be clinical. I'm looking at this from a market perspective, but I'm just not very confident that there's much that the administration can do to juice the economy this year. Now, we just got Q4 GDP numbers, and they're fine. Domestic final private demand is fine. So, it's not necessarily doomsday for the Republican Party. But on the other hand, when it comes to the president using policies or managing the economy to try to generate a better political outcome, I don't think he has many options. First of all, the court and the Senate combined prevent him from seizing control of the Federal Reserve and inducing ultra dovish monetary policy. Second of all, he can only provide a little bit of tariff relief, like we're talking about here. The tariffs ultimately might be cut in half, but that's going to take 5 months to do that. And then if we think about what other things he could do, maybe he could cut taxes, but he doesn't have the votes in Congress to do that. The only other things are executive orders, and the problem with those is that if he uses an executive order to intervene in the economy, a lot of times the federal courts will intervene and stop him, just like they intervened and stopped President Biden from giving unilateral student debt relief.
Sure. Well, does the government need to do much? In other words, let's evaluate the health of the economy. So the latest CPI numbers came out, and it was down 1.1% from the previous month. So inflation is stabilizing. The unemployment rate is at 4.3%, which is down from November's 4.5%. Although we have Governor Christopher Waller saying that the 2025 payroll numbers will likely be revised down to show zero net job growth, so not strong labor market growth, but it's not falling apart. So does the president need to do much to appease the Americans before November?
Yeah, great question. Great question. And this is going to get to the heart of what the whole issue is in the United States, which is inequality. And both the right and the left acknowledge that. It used to be the left wing talked about inequality. What we've seen under the Trump movement is the right wing talks about, everybody's talking about inequality. That's because it's objectively real. And it aggravates people. And so each incumbent party finds itself getting punished. People are unhappy. Well, why? In the 2010s, they were unhappy because of too sluggish of an economy and too weak inflation. It was a deflationary context and people were complaining. They voted for Trump. In 2024, it's an inflationary context. They're voting for Trump, right? So the temperature is always too cold or too hot. That's because the internal state of the nation is aggrieved over this inequality. And so, and affordability is part of that, right? Affordability isn't just about inflation. It's also about people's real wages. So what we're seeing is that people are going to be griping. They're going to be unhappy. Now, the unemployment rate is low, as you say. The job growth, though, has not been good. Waller was correct on that. And it's all been in the healthcare sector. So the problem is if you get more erosion in the job market and it turns out that inflation is sort of running in that 2.5 to 3% range rather than moving down to 2% target, that's not going to be great for the president and the ruling party. They're already lined up, the Republicans, for a 30 or 40 seat loss in the House. Mm-hmm. It could get worse than that. And they do have a competitive race in the Senate. I mean, they're favored in the Senate for sure, but they could lose the Senate. And the way to do that would be to have higher inflation and higher unemployment.
Well, Trump mentioned several times in today's speech how well the stock market's doing, Dow's at all-time highs. So put it this way, what do they have to do to not screw this up? In other words, if the stock markets tank, right, we have a wealth effect, the wealthy spend less, maybe that'll slow economic growth down. So what needs to happen for them to not crash the stock markets?
Yeah. Okay. Let's just start from the beginning. First of all, they need to go ahead and do more trade deals with countries and lower tariffs. Start declaring successes on the trade front. And we already saw this with China and India. But basically, instead of doing battle with the Supreme Court, take it as a blessing in disguise, accept that the tariffs are going to move down. Don't move fast on these Section 301 tariffs. Let those Section 122 ones expire. Maybe let them expire earlier. and let the tariff rate fall. That'll provide fiscal easing for the economy. It'll definitely juice the stock market, and it might, in fact, support a little bit more consumption through lower inflation. Then the other thing is you would need to avoid an oil shock in Iran. So in other words, keep negotiating, drag the negotiations out. If you need to bomb Iran, which I think they are going to do, by the way, but I'm just saying if their sole purpose is the midterm election, then they should wait until after the election. But, that's developing pretty fast and they don't control everything. So they may end up having to take action sooner. But you don't want an oil shock. You don't want higher tariffs. You need to keep the trade truce going with China. You need to visit China in April, have Xi Jinping come visit later, and keep the talk going, make it seem like we're moving toward a phase 2 trade deal. And then, of course, you also need to strike a balance with Russia. It's okay to negotiate a ceasefire in Ukraine, but if Russia starts sabotaging European infrastructure, which is what they've been doing, you need to signal to Russia that that's not going to fly, because that could create problems as well. If the president can balance those issues, then, Republicans, they're still going to lose the House, but they might save the Senate, and then the president would have a little bit of a bulwark when he goes into the last 2 years of his term.
Okay, let's just jump straight into Iran then, since you brought it up. They are going to bomb Iran. That's what you said. Okay, well, the question is why and when. Let's start from this article here. CNN publishes this headline: U.S. military prepared to strike Iran as early as this weekend. That's in 2 days, but Trump has yet to make a final call. We don't have a final call on that yet, right? We're speaking on Friday. It could change by tomorrow. Who knows? And this is from Kalshi, a prediction market. U.S. Iran nuclear deal. 51% of traders on this particular market believe that there will be a deal before the end of the year. I guess if there's a deal, there's no bombing, though, right? So what's your take?
Yeah, well, look, here's what I meant when I said that, and I didn't mean to be glib. I mean, obviously, this is a really big deal, and it could be catastrophic for global. But here's the thing: the president has already ordered strikes on Iran. Last year, we struck the nuclear program and the ballistic missile program. So when you're producing your settings as an investor for how you approach the issue, you can't say, "Oh, well, we're not going to bomb Iran." Well, I mean, we're already in a war with Iran. So you have to set your settings as the U.S. is already conducting operations against Iran. Israel certainly is. The U.S. also probably is. Now, the other element of that is, what can Iran give? If they say, well, they'll give up their nuclear program, that's the minimum. Trump can accept that, and then he can declare victory, and he can go home, and then he can revisit the issue later after the midterm election. But interestingly, they're not willing to do that, even though the U.S. has already effectively just demolished the nuclear program, because they know that they ultimately want a nuclear deterrent, and they want a ballistic missile deterrent, because they're afraid that the U.S. and Israel are just going to keep coming back and hitting them harder after each episode. There's a lack of trust. They can't trust U.S. promises. Trump already walked away from the 2015 deal. And Trump, of course, can't trust the Iranians. They've been building up all their missile capability and trying to sort of run the region through terrorist proxy groups. So there's no trust. And ultimately, where does it lead to? Well, they can't give up the missiles, because if they do, Trump can come back on November 4th and he could say that, on second thought, I would like to have your regime change. They don't want that. They need the defensive capability.
I would want to have a regime change. I've seen memes online that the leader of Iran is going to be wearing the next Nike tech suit, which is what Maduro wore. In other words, is the leader of Iran, the supreme ruler of Iran, going to be the next Maduro?
Well, it's an interesting question, and not only the U.S. but also Israel has been able to decapitate the leaders of key, organizations in foreign states. So, it could happen. The issue is that the Iranians have much greater asymmetric capabilities to strike back, and that's why the president probably won't go that route, at least not this year. He knows if he does take out the leadership, that the state will probably react pretty ferociously. Instead, like I'm saying, he just keeps targeting their offensive capabilities, like nuclear or ballistic missile. But if he does go for the core elements of the regime, that's where we get into this territory where they will then go for American bases. So he could suffer a political black eye, like Jimmy Carter did, bad thing to have happen in an election year. Or they could go for oil infrastructure in the region. We have a supply shock. So that's not his goal. The real risk here is that because the U.S. has such firepower in the region, and because global inventories, including OECD inventories, outside of the Middle East, they're well stacked enough that maybe the Americans believe they can do this war anyway. Maybe they believe there's enough oil out there that they can conduct strikes, weaken the regime, and even if the regime hits oil infrastructure, it won't cause that big of a price pushback. It seems like a very risky approach to take during an election year.
Okay, can we gauge U.S. military intent by just looking at its deployment pattern, though? In other words, what they're going to do next this is from the BBC, they published an article, U.S. military deployments. We know that the U.S.'s Gerald Ford, which is the largest aircraft carrier and the largest aircraft carrier in the world, by the way, and its accompanying battle group is currently moving to support an existing the USS Abraham Lincoln, which is already in the region. F-35s and F-22s have been flown to the region as well. If this is just gunboat diplomacy, in other words, just showing a show of force before you negotiate with somebody, is all of this necessary? And keep in mind, we have military intelligence experts saying that the current military U.S. buildup in the Middle East is showing more depth and sustainability, quote unquote, than what they did with Venezuela a month ago. So in other words, do they need all of this if they just want to scare Iran into making a deal, or is this actually a precursor to a real operation here?
Exactly. That's the point, is that this is way overkill if you're just trying to flex your muscles and be symbolic and pressure Iran. This is preparing for Iran to shoot missiles at Israel, at shipping, for the Houthis to come back out and try to hit ships in the Red Sea, for the Iranians to try to hit the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. I mean, this is preparation for retaliation. That's why it was such an important signal when the U.S. withdrew its forces from Syria. Now, of course, they said that was for unrelated reasons, but obviously what they're doing is they're getting troops out of harm's way because they're expecting retaliation. And again, why would they do that? The underlying issue is that the Iranian economy is collapsing, society is rising, and it's challenging the regime, so the regime is vulnerable. Israel and the United States cannot miss the opportunity to force either a policy change or a regime change. I think Israel wants regime change. I think the U.S. would be satisfied with just a national policy change. But either way, it's happening. And it's happening from the ground up within Iran, and the U.S. and Israel are clearly deciding that they can't miss the opportunity. So that's why the U.S. is building up, and that's why, again, it's hard to believe that there's going to be a deal. But look, Iran could pivot, given that they're facing all of this armada, and they could say, look, we're willing to never enrich uranium on our soil again, and we will allow you to inspect the missile sites, or we'll dismantle the missiles, and we'll open up our economy to American investment. It could happen. I don't think we should rule it out. I just would only give like a 20% chance to that happening.
Even if that happens, Matt, does the U.S. have an incentive to go in and institute a regime change either way?
No. If they just say, I mean, a minimum, they just say, look, we're going to give our full and complete account of all of our nuclear activities, and we're going to let you verify by inspecting them at all times, and we're not going to be in the nuclear business anymore. That's sufficient for Donald Trump. He can declare victory. He can say he's got a great deal, and he doesn't have to risk a major war in an election year.
But long term, though, I mean, even before the election, I remember Kamala Harris was on the campaign trail calling Iran literally the most dangerous foe or enemy that the Americans face. And so even if a deal were to be reached long term, though, I mean, shouldn't a regime change be enacted? Donald Trump went from, no, I don't want a regime change, to now I want one.
I don't think maybe, but I don't think he's actually made that decision yet. Because that decision will define his presidency, because Iran is a porcupine. It's going to be messy if he tries to change that regime. And it might not end up with a more copacetic partner, I don't think Kamala Harris was right about that. I think that's another example of her just sort of wildly talking without having an assessment. I mean, the biggest challenge to the U.S. is China. over long term. And not that there's, not that China's evil, just that these are competitors. They have enormous capabilities. Iran doesn't have anywhere near the capability to challenge the United States over the long run. It really is just an issue of Iran. Here's the thing. Iran had some capability. They had enough to influence the region and maybe even create a sphere of influence. And they were working with Russia and China. And what the U.S. is effectively saying is that's not going to happen. We're not going to have a region that's heavily influenced by an Iran that's backed by Russia and China and that has nuclear arms. That's not going to happen. And that's what the U.S. is saying here.
WTI crude is at $66. It's up about, seven, 8% since a few days ago. Matt, will the Iranians close the Strait of Hormuz? They partially closed it a few days ago, but not fully, and oil didn't really move much in the day. There's a 40% chance traders are placing on the Strait of Hormuz being closed. What's your assessment? Is that a likely path it will take?
Only if the regime is failing for some reason. So if there's a massive new wave of protests and it gets to 2 or 3 million people and the U.S. and Israel are sort of conducting strikes, then yeah, they could close the Strait of Hormuz. Or if the U.S. and Israel are conducting strikes and they're hitting core elements of the regime, they're decapitating the leader, etc., yeah, they could close the Strait of Hormuz. But we should just recognize it's a tool that they use, they try to use, only if they have already decided that their regime could fail anyway, so there's nothing left to lose. And at that point, they have an incentive to deal an economic blow to the world and specifically to the United States, because if the oil price goes up, Americans will become more divided. Trump will lose support. The election will go against the president, and there will be a growing, more vocal group within the White House and the national security establishment saying, well, maybe we should cut our losses and back off so that we don't create a U.S. recession.
Well, couldn't the U.S. Navy just do something to reopen the Strait of Hormuz? I mean, how would that work practically?
Yeah. If they do close it, then yeah, the U.S. is going to have to go in there and obliterate all of their Navy and their missile installations and their forces, and it's going to have to take demine it, so that the mines don't blow up ships that try to go through.
Sure.
And that could take. Some people think that could take a month. Some people think it might only take a couple of weeks. And by the way, you could have a ship. You could have an American naval vessel sunk during this conflict, which would be, a terrible thing, and it would be terrible, of course, for the Iranians. So, the whole concept here is the reason why we care and the reason why it's different from the past, the reason why they could close Hormuz is if the regime has no longer a pathway, probabilistically, to survive.
Let's just end the discussion on Iran here then. When you say retaliation for a U.S. strike, what are we looking at?
Well, look, I mean, they can hit U.S. bases and keep and they can attack Israel. They can keep the retaliation focused on non-energy assets. And what that does is it says, well, look, if you attack the Iranian people, we're going to attack your people. But we're just going to quietly not attack the oil supply because they know that the president might become extremely ferocious and aggressive if they threaten the economy during the election. The problem is, though, that let's say they're successful and they kill a bunch of U.S. troops in a U.S. base, well, the thing is it will unite America. The public will rally around the flag and rally around behind the president, and then he will hit Iran harder. So in a way, maybe they will prioritize some energy assets, and maybe what they'll do is instead of hitting fixed assets that could cause, long-term damage, maybe they will just start targeting shipping, not fully close Hormuz, and see how the president reacts. If he reacts very fiercely to that, then of course we could end up with that sort of showdown where it's a question of can they block Hormuz prior to the U.S.'s ability to destroy their capability.
Are you long oil? And I guess broadly speaking, you've noted that geopolitical factors are probably the most dominant macro drivers in 2026. Which assets benefit from geopolitical forces at play this year? Yeah,
I mean, first of all, everyone who's watching, I mean, we should all be aware that geopolitics sort of waxes and wanes in terms of its relevance for the markets. And you know that. And
Sure.
in the long term, you stay invested, you stay diversified, all those things. But what we're faced with today, and the U.S. GDP numbers supported it, is that the U.S. economy has proved resilient. So the global growth is sort of holding up. And there's various problems and there's various risks and concerns. But if global growth is holding up, then those of us who are watching what risks could affect the market, we're going to gravitate toward geopolitics because there's a lot happening in Iran in particular. So near term, yes, I think oil continues to rally. Now, this is a really risky thing because, of course, like we've already discussed today, there's a chance that Iran gives up its nuclear program and then we have a deal and then the oil price falls. So what you're doing is you're just tilting a little bit in favor of energy stocks or oil price. You're also probably going to continue to hold gold for now, but I wouldn't necessarily be loading up on gold. Gold has had this tremendous rally. You're just sort of in a tilt toward energy and commodities. And then you're going to wait and see how this pans out, because what could happen is early March, the IAEA will have a meeting around Iran's nuclear program. If they come and they give up their nuclear program, well, then you're going to want to be selling quick and booking gains. On the other hand, if they come and there's just sort of more talking and nothing doing, then very likely the U.S. is going to conduct strikes, and then that would provide a new selling opportunity for oil and gold.
In the last 2 minutes, I just want to get your response to this. This has nothing to do with Iran or the Supreme Court, but Trump wants to declassify alien files. Based on the tremendous interest shown, I will be directing the Secretary of War and other relevant departments and agencies to begin the process of identifying and releasing government files related to alien and extraterrestrial life. You'll recall that Obama, on a podcast recently, said that, quote unquote, aliens are real. They're real. He denied that they're in Area 51, all that conspiracy, but they're real. And then Trump later said in a press conference, Obama made a big mistake by revealing state secrets. He doesn't know if they're real or not. He won't admit it, but now he's going to declassify alien files. And now traders have a market for this. Will the U.S. confirm that aliens exist before 2027? 21% chance by the end of the year. I don't know. What awesome. Can you just respond? Yeah, awesome. Is this?
I mean, I
maybe this will help him with his midterms. Maybe, I don't know.
Well, what it does is it changes the topic on social media to these to conspiracy theories or let's just say science fiction, to the topic of let's talk about that rather than talk about the Supreme Court ruling or potentially the rising oil price from Iran. But let me say, what Obama said was not unreasonable, and I'm sure I haven't followed every Trump remark on extraterrestrials, but the whole notion, that the universe is gigantic, right? That's what Obama was saying. So there's just probabilistic things here, and you can go to the NASA website and read about some of the probabilities that people have tried to calculate. The point is that throwing this out there is just a red herring to get people looking the other way when the president doesn't have, like we talked about earlier, doesn't have the tools to manipulate the economy to produce a better political outcome for the midterm.
Why is he not being indicted for the Epstein files, by the way? Why is that? Why are the Democrats not pursuing this path round two?
Well, they will if they get control of Congress. But I mean, that just has to do with whether you hold power or whether you're out of power. When you're out of power, you always want to indict everyone and hold them accountable. When you're in power, you want to, you don't want to indict yourself and hold yourself accountable and kick yourself out of power. Fair enough. By the way, that's one of the key assumptions that we have to make to do this kind of assessment. One of the reasons why the commentary is so wild all over the place with all the different political opinions is because people forget to keep their eye on the ball. When you're investing, you focus on power and you look at how politicians try to hang on to power.
Matt, final question. Do you think there are aliens?
I mean, I think I already showed my cards on that one. I'm going to leave it. I'm going to be like Obama and leave it on that.
Okay. Matt, where can we follow your work?
BCA Research, Geopolitical Strategy and U.S Political Strategy. Check it out.
Okay, we'll put the links down below. So yes, do check out BCA Research. Full disclosure, I used to work there, so they do have great research. Matt, thank you for your time.
You did great work there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And don't forget to use my code LIN, L-I-N, when you sign up to Kalshi, link down below, or scan the QR code here. And new users, remember, will get $10 deposited to your account when you trade $10.